Aloha! Today we're at Hiʻi Agricultural Heiau, located on one of the first benchlands of Lānaʻi. And so this area is known as Hiʻi, which means to lift up or to cradle. And if you imagine the cloud that drifts down from the uplands of Lānaʻi down to this area, you can think about it as being like cradled in this area. And so that's why we call this place Hiʻi. It most likely had a specific name for this heiau in traditional times, but unfortunately a lot of place names were lost after Hawaiian language was banned in the early 1900s, so there's a lot of place names and knowledge that would have been passed down from generation to generation that unfortunately we don't have access to. So we know that this region was called Hiʻi, and so we call this heiau Hiʻi as well. A heiau is a spiritual or religious center for Hawaiians, and they occurred all across the Hawaiian Islands, and we had quite a few of them here on Lānaʻi. Hiʻi is one of the few that have been maintained in the upland areas. A lot of heiau in other places were unfortunately destroyed due to development, other things, and actually at Hiʻi, maybe a few hundred yards below where we were, there were actually pineapple fields. And so if the machinery had come just a few hundred yards up and cleared out this area, we wouldn't have Hiʻi today. So we're very fortunate that we are able to come and take care of this place and visit and learn about the history here. When we speak about benchlands, we're talking about the flat area that sits below Lānaʻi behind us, but above Palawai Basin. And so the first bench, or what people call first bench, is actually called Hiʻi. Second bench is called Waiapaʻa. Third bench is Kaluanui, and fourth bench is Waiakeakua. And so from this vantage point, we're able to see the very uppermost points of our island, Lānaʻi, which captures a lot of our moisture, and down into Palawai Basin, which was the remnants of the ancient caldera that formed Lānaʻi, and then eventually down to the coast.
So apart from its cultural significance, Hiʻi also offers us an awesome opportunity to understand a watershed in practice. So a watershed is a system that allows us to analyze water capture from the top of the hale and then its effects all the way down. And so here at Hiʻi, what we can see and what we want to know about is how water gets captured into the ground by these different plants. And so at Hiʻi, we know that there are lots of different native plants. Like right here we have ʻOhiʻalehua and wauke growing together, and it's this diversity of species that allows water to percolate into our groundwater aquifer, which is basically just how much water is stored underneath the earth. And so when we were talking about invasive species though, what they do instead of funneling water into the ground is they take water and use it for themselves. So that's why they get to be so tall. And so what we want is a diverse community of species that works together so that we have lots of water to use. The big trees behind me are eucalyptus trees, and eucalyptus is an example of a plant that is introduced and invasive. And so when we say invasive, we mean that it takes over forests, right? And so why eucalyptus are particularly bad for our native forests is that they grow really tall, and lots of our native species grow more closer to the ground. And that means that they can pull water in. And so the fact that eucalyptus grows so tall is one of the reasons why it's really bad for our forests. Also, eucalyptus release a toxin into the ground, which means that our plants actually can't grow next to them. So things like uluhe and other types of ferns also find that toxin to be toxic, and so they can't grow next to eucalyptus.
So Cook Island pine trees, which are the really tall pine trees that you see all over town and dotting along the edge of the ridge on Lānaʻi, are introduced species. So that means that they were brought here from somewhere else and they aren't native to the area. Introduced means that they were brought here. So Cook Island pine trees were brought here for a specific reason, which was to try to recapture some of the cloud moisture that was lost after they introduced goats and sheep and deer to the island, and they deforested a lot of our native species, which would have been preferable to restore. But Cook Island pine trees are an example of an introduced but not invasive species. So they're introduced because they were brought here, but they're not invasive because they don't totally take over a landscape. They pretty much only stay where they're planted. So even though it seems like there are a lot in town, All of those trees were purposefully planted at one point, probably close to 100 years ago. The ones that are in Palawai Basin were planted in the 90s, but they pretty much stay where they're planted and they don't spread and overtake the area, pushing out native plants.
This right next to me is Hiʻalehua, and you've probably seen it before. It's one of the most noticeable and recognizable plants that we have here in Hawaii, and ohia is native to our paeʻaina, and we know that because after a lava flow comes, the Hiʻalehua is one of the first trees to pop up after lava has covered land. And so what we mean by native is that we know that it was here before humans, and it's like traditionally a plant that made up our forests. And so if you can imagine beforehand, the forests of Hiʻi were possibly made up of ohia trees.
So our Pūlama Lānaʻi Culture and Historic Preservation crew began clearing out this area of invasive species a few years ago, and before it looked like much of the invasive dense forest behind us. So that is comprised of a lot of strawberry guava and albizia and eucalyptus, and all of those plants grow so densely together that they basically create a monoculture that only allows other plants of their own species to grow, and it's very hard for native plants to survive in those kinds of conditions. But a really positive result of some of the clearing of invasive species in this area is behind me, which is this beautiful Lāʻi plant. And so Lāʻi is tea leaf, and it was a very important plant in traditional times. But what's really interesting is that the preservation crew actually didn't plant these. So there are three main things that any plant needs to survive, which includes space, water, and sunlight. And so when you have lots of invasive species taking over an area, that pretty much limits a lot of space and sunlight that native plants can access, which makes it really difficult for them to grow. But once the crew came through and cleared out all of that dense invasive forest, it opened up space and sunlight and access to water that perhaps other native plants wouldn't have gotten a chance to get. And so these Lāʻi actually came back on their own. Once they had access to sunlight and water, they just popped up on their own, which is a very incredible thing, actually, that they were dormant all these years, probably for many decades, and just came back.